Hey folks, it's Kieran again, and this is going to be the second installment of the accessible components I've been working on based on Dave Rupert's nutrition cards for accessible components. Now again, they're a set of, it's basically an attempt to digest the official documentation in the ARIA authoring practices guide. And make it a bit more easier to understand and digest, basically. So today, as you can see from the nutrition card here, we're going to be looking at a button component. So that is this component here. So in the interest of making this video a lot shorter than the one last week, because last week I said it was going to be quick and then it was 50 minutes, which is ridiculous. I'm going to try and skim over the bits that I think are less important, but focus in on the bits that are highly relevant. So yeah, let's get started. So we're going to have two types of button. So we're going to have a standard button that just does something when you activate it. So you click it and it shows an alert saying you just activated a native HTML button element. It has the required button role, focus outline, and keyboard functionality by default. And the second button is a toggle button, so it's got an on-off state, and that state is announced to assistive technologies such as screen readers. So those are our two buttons we're working with. Now let's look at the nutrition card to see what we need. Basically, the reason this nutrition card for this component exists is just preaching, really, to use native HTML, semantic HTML elements rather than just using divs everywhere, basically. So for example, focus expectations, visible keyboard focus state. So we've got that. As you can see, these buttons have a little ring around them. I haven't really done much to customize the focus state. I offset it a little bit so that it's not directly touching the borders, but that's it. And we get that for free because each of these buttons is a native is an actual button element. So we get that for free. Has role of button, e.g., and again, it's suggesting to use the button element. Again, we get that for free just because we're using a button element, so we don't need to do anything with that. Basically, you can set a role attribute on HTML elements, which gives it different types of roles for different types of widgets that will be announced to assistive technologies. But yeah, one of those roles is button, but just by using the native element, you don't have to do that. So that's taken care of for us. A clear, non-repetitive label. So by default, that's just the button's text content. So we've done that already. So this label is show alert and the other one is favorite. So again, that's taken care of for us. And the keyboard expectations. So pressing enter or space should activate the button. And again, just because we use the button element, it's all taken care of. So we can press tab to tab through the page, and shift tab lets us go backwards. So that's great. And if I press space, the button's activated. And if I press enter now, it's activated. And again here, I'll press space and it works. And now I'll press enter and it works. So we've met all of our expectations there just by using the native element. So that's really what this is about. However, I did want to touch on the toggle button because it's not mentioned explicitly in the nutrition card, but it is mentioned in the ARIA authoring practices, which is what these nutrition cards are based on. So a toggle button is basically, I mean, it's kind of obvious, but I'll just go through it anyway. It's a button that has some kind of checked or on or off state, but it's different from a checkbox. It's more like, if you imagine like on a video player, like on YouTube, for example, and you've got the little mute button, that's going to have two states, isn't it? So it's either muted or unmuted. And this is actually mentioned in the guide here. So I'm just gonna read this out. Or you can pause the video and read it yourself if you want. But a toggle button is a two-state button that can be either off, not pressed, or on, pressed. To tell assistive technologies that a button is a toggle button, specify a value for the attribute ARIA pressed. For example, a button labeled mute in an audio player could indicate that sound is muted by setting the press state true. Important, it is critical that the label on a toggle does not change when its state changes. In this example, when the press state is true, the label remains mute, so a screen reader would say something like mute toggle button pressed. Alternatively, if the design were to call for the button label to change from mute to unmute, the aria pressed attribute would not be needed. Okay, so looking at my component, if we look at the toggle button that we've got here, so, well, actually, I'll go over to the my editor because it'd be easier to see. So, it's got aria press set to false because we don't want the button to be activated by default. And then when let me see if I can increase the size of the dev tools. Okay, that should be better. Let's go up one more. So you can see aria pressed is false, but if I go and activate it, it sets to true. And if I deactivate it, it goes back to false again. So that's what we want. I guess one other thing I'll mention is the SVG. So that's this little heart icon. And as my little note here says, it's from Font Awesome that I've borrowed this from. These attributes are so aria hidden, focusable, and roll. These are all included by default with the Font Awesome icons. I guess the main one I would talk about now is this aria hidden set to true. So basically what that does is it's intended for hiding extraneous content from assistive technologies. So by having this set, it means that a screen reader, for example, isn't going to try and read out the contents of the icon because it's irrelevant. The button's label really is just favorite. So all that means is the screen reader is going to ignore the SVG and it's going to read out just the favorite label, which is what we want. So that's all I'll mention there. In terms of, I'm not really going to bother to touch on the styles too much. It's nothing too fancy. It's just some styles to make the buttons look the way they do. So we can skip over that for now in the interest of time. The actual JavaScript, I guess I'll go a bit more in depth on this. So the first thing we do is get the main element. Now the reason we do that is because we're using a technique here called event delegation. So instead of attaching a click handler to the show alert button and attaching a click handler to the toggle button, what I'm actually doing is listening for click events on their closest common ancestor, which is this main element. So I'm listening for clicks in this part of the page, and then if anything other than those two buttons was clicked, we just skip. We quit the function execution. We don't do anything. We only want to run our code when one of the two buttons is clicked. So yeah, so we get our main element here, and then at the bottom we attach our event listener to the main element. And you can see we're passing in this handle click function, which is defined here. Now this bit at the top here, get the closest button, this is where we're checking that a button was actually clicked. So the event target is always the thing that was actually, it's always the element that actually fired the event. So if I just show you that quickly, if I console log event target and then just return, so that means you can see it's been grayed out. That just means the rest of this function won't run just while I'm showing you this. So it means, let me reduce the size of this again. So if I go to my console here, so if I click, for example, on this heading here, oh, why is that not working? Sorry, I might need to refresh. There you go. So if I click on that heading there, the event target is the H2 element. If I click on the paragraph, that's the event target. If I click on the button, that's the event target. If I click on this little white space here, now it's the article element itself. So you get the idea. But we want to filter it so that it only applies to the buttons. So if you click on anything else, we just want to skip. So that's what this next part is for. I will say though that I'm using the closest method, and basically what that does is it gets the closest element to the target element, that matches this CSS selector. So we're trying to get the closest button. Now the reason why we need that is because you'll notice here, so if looking at the toggle button, if I click on the toggle button itself, that is the event target, which is great. But if you actually click precisely on the SVG, you're either going to get the path element or the SVG element itself, and that's obviously not the button. So what the closest method does is, it means that, say if you click on this path, for example, it's going to go, okay, get me the closest button. So it will go up one to the SVG, and then up to the button. It'll go, okay, this is our button, so this is what we want. And the great thing is, it's also going to work still for our other button, which doesn't have a child element, and that's because the closest method starts with the element itself. So we're saying, okay, get me the closest button, and then it kind of goes, oh, well, this is already a button, so great, we'll just use that. So yeah, that's where we verify that we've clicked on a button, and then this part here where it says, if not button, return. So the return statement lets you return a value from a function. But if you don't specify a value, it just returns undefined, and that is what a function actually does by default. So if you don't specify a return value at all, the function will return undefined. But the great thing about the return statement is it stops any further code from executing. You kind of saw a second ago, if I just did return, it all gets grayed out. So none of that code is ever going to be reached. So basically saying, if there isn't a button, just quit. So all the rest of this doesn't get run, essentially. But if it does get run, then we know we've clicked on one of the buttons, right? And then I've got a little switch statement here to check the ID of the button that was clicked. So I'm basically saying, if the alert button was clicked, so if the ID of the element is alert, which is the case on our alert button, then we alert our message, which we have set in a constant up here. And then if the ID was toggle, which is the case on our favorite button, so the ID there is toggle, then we call this toggle function, passing in the button itself. I'll get to that in just a second. And then our default condition is just, if it wasn't either of those IDs, again, just return, so just do nothing. Now, going to this toggle function here, so it takes in the button itself, and all we do is work out what the state of the attribute should be and then update it. So first we get the value of the aria pressed attribute by using this get attribute method. So for example, when the page first loads, it's going to be false. So we're going to get that value, the string value false. And then we work out what the new value should be. So if the old value was true, then the new one should be false, and vice versa. If the old value is false, the new one should be true. And then we just call the set attribute method on aria pressed and just set it to the new state. And again, if you watch closely, you can see it's just switching between true and false. That's all that does. Yeah, that's honestly all there is to it. As I say, all the keyboard handling is taken care of for us just because we used native button elements, which is wonderful. Oh, my bad. One thing I forgot to mention, I wanted to show you what the screen reader experience was like. So I'm on a Mac, so I've switched to Safari, and that is because the Mac has a screen reader called VoiceOver built in. And as far as I know, it's only officially supported in Safari. It will kind of work in other browsers like Chrome or whatever, but for the best experience, you should use Safari for it. So I particularly wanted to just call attention to what the toggle button does. It should announce it's like checked or unchecked or toggled on or toggled off state, that sort of thing. So let's just go through and see what happens. So I'm going to turn on VoiceOver now, and I'm not going to speak too much while it's on because you probably won't be able to hear me, but let's just listen closely and see what happens.
VoiceOver on Safari. Button. Link. New trick link. Why aria show alert. Button. Article. You are currently on a button. To click this button, press Control, Option, Space. Close toggle button. You just activated a native HTML button element. It has the required button role, focus outline, and keyboard functionality by default. Close toggle button has keyboard focus. You are currently on a toggle button. To click this button, press Control, Option, Space. Show alert button. Favorite toggle button, article. You are currently on a toggle button. To select or deselect this tick box, press Control, Option, Space. Selected. Selected. VoiceOver off.
Okay, so hopefully that was insightful or informative, so you could see that the toggle button, it was announcing whether it was switched on or off, which is great. And both of these were announced as buttons, again, because we're using the native button element, which is great. So yeah, once again, thanks for watching. I'd love to know what you think, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.